All right, I'm going to go over problem number 10 again and just explain it a little bit more thoroughly. These are the ones that you are interpreting group means from a factorial design. And it says the Fruit Stuff Corporation, which manufactured dried fruit snacks, is looking to find the best way to display and sell its product. There are two types of stores that sell the snacks, supermarkets and health food stores. There are two possibilities of display methods within the store: in the checkout line to encourage impulse buying, and in the snack section. Fruit Stuff selected an equal number of supermarkets and health food stores for an experiment. Half of the supermarkets were asked to display the Fruit Stuff products in the checkout line, and half were asked to display the product in the snack section. The same held for the health food stores. Half displayed the product in the checkout line and half in the snack section. After a week, Fruit Stuff recorded the sales in dollars of its products at each store. Then the corporation computed the mean sales amount for each of the four groups. Shown below are the four possible graphs displaying these group means, and answer the questions below about these graphs. So, there are two ways they're going to ask this question, and they're actually going to ask you three questions, but the first two they're going to switch around, which I didn't point out when I first went over it. So I want to point out that you have to watch for, is the information along the x-axis or along the y-axis when you're looking at these questions. And so in my pictures you'll see I drew a bunch of extra lines and stuff in there, and I'll explain why I drew those in there as I go. So the first question there says, which graphs show that the two display methods had different overall means? Choose all that apply. So you have to watch to see, is the information that they're asking for along the x-axis or along the y-axis. In this case, the two display methods, if I slide up to my pictures, were the checkout line and the snack section. The checkout line and the snack section are along your y-axis going up and down. And so if you're checking that, when it's along the y-axis, you're looking for, are the midpoints of each of the thing the same point? So is my midpoint for the first line and my midpoint for the second line the same? So if I look at my graphs, if I look at the first one here, you'll see that the midpoint of my first line would be right here in the middle. The midpoint of the second line would also be right in the middle. They intersect in one point. So that would mean that the two display methods would be the same because they intersect in that one point. Now that's the only one on these four that intersect there. If I look at my other graphs, the midpoint of my top line is up here. My midpoint of my bottom line is down here. They're not intersecting in the same point. There's two different points, two different midpoints. Then if I look at graph 3, same thing. The midpoint of the top line is right there in the middle. The midpoint of the bottom line is the middle of that line. Again, they're not the exact same point, so they're not going to be the same. And then if I look at my other two lines, again, the midpoint of the checkout line would be right up here. The midpoint of my snack section would be on the snack section line. They're not going to be the same point. So on that top question, it says, which graphs show that the two different display methods had different overall means? The only one that had the same mean was the first one, and so you'll notice that I checked the option, or graph 2, graph 3, and graph 4. Those have different overall means. Now the second question says, which graph above shows that the two store types had different overall means? The store types were the supermarket and the health food store. You can see those are along the x-axis when you look at those. So when I'm looking at the x-axis, I want to know, is the mean line straight or horizontal? So if I would find the mean halfway between each of those, would it make a straight line? So again, if I go back and I look at the first graph, if I found the mean of the two endpoints, I would put a dot right there in the middle. The mean here is obviously where it meets right in the middle. If I would do the mean of those two endpoints, it would be right here, and I would draw a straight line. That's what it's saying. Do you have a straight line? So, do this two store types overall mean? It's asking if it's different. In this case, it's not going to be different because I can make a straight line when I find the mean of those points. As opposed to the second one, if I found the mean of my two endpoints, it would be somewhere in the middle here. If I found the mean somewhere in the middle, again, halfway between those two dots, and then the mean of the end halfway between those two dots, when I draw that line, it's not going to be exactly straight. It's slanted. It has a slope going up, not straight. Well, that would have a zero slope. So that would be one that you're going to mark that is different because my mean line is not an exact straight horizontal line. Again, on number 3, if I'm looking at number 3, I would do my endpoint. The mean of my two endpoints would be exactly halfway between those two endpoints. The mean of my midpoints halfway between there. The mean of my endpoints halfway between there. When I draw that line is slanted up. It's not exactly horizontal, so since that mean line slants up, it is not going to, or it's going to have different overall means. So again, I would check that one for different overall means because my line slants up. It doesn't go straight horizontal. And then I do number 4. Halfway between my two endpoints, I would put a dot. Halfway between my two midpoints, I'd put a dot. Halfway between my other two endpoints, I'd put a dot. I draw my line. My line again is slightly slanted. It is not exactly straight horizontal. So since it's slanted, it is going to have a different overall mean. So again, when I checked my marks on there, I marked graph 2, graph 3, and graph 4. My bottom one says which graphs show evidence of interaction between the two factors, display method, and types of stores. So it will show an interaction if my two lines are not parallel. If my lines are parallel, then there's no interaction. They don't ever meet. So if I look at my first graph there, those two lines are not parallel. Here's one line, here's the other. They meet in the middle. That one does show an interaction, so I would check that. Graph 2 again, this one goes across, this one goes up. If I would extend those lines, eventually they would intersect. They're not parallel lines, so it would show an interaction. The third one there, if you look at those two lines are parallel. If I continued in both directions, I never intersect. And so that one is one that does not show an interaction. And then if I look at graph 4, you can see those two definitely intersect with each other, so that one shows an interaction. So if you look at my table there, I have marked that 1, 2, and 4 show an interaction. Number 3 is parallel, so since those two lines are parallel, that's the only one I'm going to leave unchecked. And so, just some notes here. The mean, if it's the x-axis, you're going to do halfway between your endpoints, your midpoints, and your other endpoint and draw a line. If it's a horizontal line, then it is going to not be checked because they're going to ask if they have different means. If it's a horizontal lines, then the means do not differ. If I'm looking at my y-axis, which was the top one, I am going to find halfway on each of my lines. And if halfway on each of my lines intersect in a point, then it is going to have the same mean. If they don't intersect in the same point, then they're going to differ. And then on the bottom one, it's going to be, are my lines parallel or not? If they're not parallel, then they're going to show an interaction. So I'm going to go ahead and add this in with the ones I did in class for number 11 and 12. But I hope that explains that a little bit more. But watch in the question, are you looking at the y-axis values or the x-axis values? The y-axis values will be along the side here. The x-axis values will be on the middle. That will tell you which one of the two tests you want to do. Is it a straight line will be if it's an x-axis, and do the midpoints of each line touch, then it's going to be the y-axis test. All right. Number 11, a major television network is considering 3 potential comedies: Bobby's Brunch, Her 4 Husbands, and I Like Larry. A pilot first episode for each has been videotaped. The network is trying to determine whether some of these shows are better liked than others, and whether younger viewers under age 40 tend to have different opinions than older viewers age 40 and above. The network randomly selects an equal number of people under age 40 and age 40 and above. It randomly divides those under age 40 into 3 groups of equal sizes and assigns a different show to each group. The network did the same for those age 40 and above. Each person watched the pilot episode of his assigned show and rated it on a scale from 0 to 20. After the network computed the mean rating for each group of the 6 groups, shown below are 4 possible graphs displaying the means. Answer the questions. I'm going to slide that up so we can see the questions based on our graph. So again, which graph shows that at least one show had a different overall mean from the other? So where do we have a different overall mean? So if I'm comparing my overall mean, I'm comparing my average. The average between this dot and this dot would be here. The average between this dot and this dot would be here. Again, my average ends up being a nice straight horizontal line, so this one doesn't have any difference in its overall mean. On this one, the average between this dot and this dot would be here, between those 2 dots there, between those 2 dots there, and you can see that my line keeps going up, so those ones do have different averages. On the next one, the average between these 2 dots would be here, between those 2 dots there, between those 2 dots there. My average goes nice straight across, so there is no difference. I forgot to check my, I did check my box. Graph 2, there was a difference. Graph 3, there is not a difference. Graph 4, the average between these 2 dots would be here, between those 2 dots would be there. Here they intersect, between those 2 dots would be there. Again, all of my averages end up being a nice straight horizontal line, so there is no difference. The only one where my average didn't go that nice straight line is on graph 2 where it went up. So graph 2 is the only one that shows a difference. Second one, I'm going to erase those lines out of there. Which graph showed the 2 age categories had different overall means? So here, I'm going to compare the mean of each line. So the overall mean here would be right in the middle. The overall mean here would be, whoops, I'm doing the third one instead of the first one. Let's go back to the first one. The overall mean on this line would be halfway between. The overall mean on this line would be halfway between. They're the same dot, so it wants to know if they're different. Nope, they're the same. Here, my average here would be right in the middle. My average here would be right in the middle. I do not have the same dots, so there is a difference. Here, my average here would be right in the middle. My average here would be right in the middle. Again, those are not the same dot. There is a difference. On the next one, the average of this line is a little hard to calculate, but if I just drew this here, my average would be about there. My average here would be about there. And so are those the same dots? No. My averages wouldn't be the same. And is there an interaction? If there's an interaction, they are not parallel. Those lines are not parallel. There is an interaction. These lines are parallel. No interaction. These lines are parallel. No interaction. These ones are not parallel. There is an interaction. So if there's an interaction, my lines are not parallel. Number 12. Pomeroy Restaurant is examining the satisfaction of its customers. The restaurant chain is looking for 2 possible influences on customer satisfaction. Restaurant location, North Valley or West Hills, and type of meal, lunch or dinner. At each of the 2 locations, managers choose an equal number of customers, half at lunch and half at dinner. The customers were asked to rate their satisfaction on a scale from 0 to 10. The mean satisfaction rating for each group of the 4 groups were computed. Shown below are 4 possible graphs displaying these group means. Answer the questions below about these graphs. So again, do they have a different overall mean? We're going to find the mean between each of our dots. So the mean here would be halfway between, the mean here, the mean here. If our line goes horizontal, they don't have a different mean. So here between these 2 dots I'd be here, between these 2 dots I'd be there, don't have a difference. Here, the mean between these 2 dots would be here, between those ones here, my line doesn't slope horizontally, there is a difference in that group. And on the last one, same thing here, my mean would be here, and then my mean would be somewhere here. My line again is not going to be exactly straight horizontal. So there is a difference. So I'm calculating the average between my endpoints and saying, do I get a horizontal line or not? The second one, when I'm comparing if the meals had a different overall mean, I'm calculating the midpoint of each of my colored lines. So the midpoint of dinner would be right here. The midpoint for lunch would also be right there. If I get the same dots, then they don't have a difference. I got rid of my answers for these ones. Let me get those back. On the second one, the midpoint of this line for dinner would be here. The midpoint of this line for lunch would be here. Those are 2 different dots, so yes, there is a difference. On the next one, my midpoint for dinner would be halfway on the blue line. My midpoint for lunch would be halfway on the red line. Those are 2 different dots, so there is a difference. On the next one, my midpoint for lunch, halfway between there. For dinner, halfway between here. I have 2 different dots. There is a difference. And then which graph shows there is an interaction? If they are not parallel, there is an interaction. Those lines are not parallel, so there is an interaction. These ones are parallel. Here we have a not parallel. And on the last one, those are not parallel. So if there is an interaction, they are not parallel. So first question, you're going to figure out the average between the endpoints. And if my line goes horizontal, then there is not a difference. If my line does not go horizontal, if I could draw straight, then there would be a difference. Second one, you're going to find the midpoint between each of my lines. If my midpoint ends up being the same, then there is not a difference. If my midpoint is 2 different dots, then there is a difference. Third one, if there's interaction, there is not a parallel line. So these lines were not parallel, these lines were parallel.